High society loves looking timeless, elegant, and untouchable. The problem? Half of what we associate with class is complete nonsense that was invented to flex, control, or sell a lie. Tonight we're breaking 40 bizarre myths the elite desperately want you to believe. From fake traditions to luxury scams that fooled entire generations. This isn't history class, this is the receipt folder. 1. In the 18th century, eating a pineapple was the casual snack of the wealthy elite. You might pick one up at the grocery store for a few dollars today, but back then, a single pineapple was worth the equivalent of $8,000. Here is the crazy part. They were so expensive that people didn't even eat them. That would be like eating a Ferrari. Instead, high society posers would rent a pineapple for the night just to carry it around at parties as an accessory. It was the ultimate flex to walk into a ballroom holding a spiky fruit, signaling, "Look how rich I am." Servants would carry the same rotting pineapple to 5 different events until it literally disintegrated. It wasn't food. It was a rental handbag made of sugar and fibers used to make poor people feel bad about their turnips. 2. Sticking your pinky out while drinking tea is the ultimate sign of high-class sophistication. If you do this at a dinner party today, you don't look like the Queen of England. You look like a toddler pretending to be a giant. This specific mannerism is widely believed to be an ancient aristocratic rule, but in modern etiquette circles, an extended pinky is actually considered rude and pretentious. The practice likely originated in the Middle Ages when wealthy diners ate spices with their fingers and wanted to keep the pinky clean for dipping. But applying that to a teacup is historically illiterate. True high society holds the handle firmly with fingers tucked in. When you extend that little finger, you are signaling to everyone in the room that you learned your manners from cartoons rather than a debutante ball. 3. Diamonds are the ultimate rare treasure reserved for the super rich. You've been brainwashed by the best marketing campaign in history. Diamonds are actually incredibly common. Not quite gravel in your driveway common, but close. The only reason they cost a fortune is that one company, De Beers, locked them all in a vault a century ago and released them slowly to create artificial scarcity. They literally invented the 2-month salary rule out of thin air to guilt-trip men into spending money. Before the 1930s, engagement rings weren't even really a thing. So that sparkling symbol of eternal love isn't a rare geological miracle. It's just a shiny piece of pressurized carbon with a bloated price tag and a really good PR team. You aren't buying rarity, you're buying a monopoly's lies. 4. Napoleon Bonaparte was a tiny, angry man with a Napoleon complex who conquered Europe to compensate for his height. We use his name today to mock short guys with big tempers, but the little corporal was actually a victim of a bad unit conversion. At the time of his death, he measured 5 feet 2 inches in French units, which translates to about 5 feet 7 inches in modern measurements, actually slightly taller than the average Frenchman of his era. The myth of his shortness was a brilliant propaganda campaign by the British, who drew cartoons of him as a tantrum-throwing toddler to diminish his terrifying reputation. History is written by the victors, and in this case, the victors decided to turn a military genius into a garden gnome. He didn't invade Russia because he was short. He invaded it because he was an egomaniac. 5. Lobster has always been the exquisite, high-priced delicacy of the seafood world. If you order lobster today, you feel fancy, but 150 years ago, you would have been looked at with pity. Lobster was originally considered the cockroach of the sea, a garbage food fit only for prisoners, indentured servants, and fertilizer. In fact, there were colonial laws in America specifically forbidding masters from feeding lobster to their servants more than 3 times a week because it was considered cruel and unusual punishment. It only became fancy when railways started serving it to clueless inland tourists who didn't know it was trash food. The price was jacked up, and suddenly the elite decided it was delicious. You aren't eating a delicacy, you're eating a rebranded sea bug that used to be prison loaf. 6. Medieval lords legally possessed the right of first night with peasant brides. Thanks to movies like Braveheart, we imagine evil nobles lining up to claim a bride before the groom even gets a chance. Great drama, 0 receipts. Historians can't find real laws or solid proof it was ever standard practice. What did exist was the classic medieval move: a marriage fee, a little pay-to-play tax for permission to wed on the lord's land. It wasn't a romantic tradition or a legal right. It was a shakedown. On a peasant's wedding day, the first thing that got taken wasn't the bride. It was their money. 7. The massive powdered wigs of the 18th century were worn purely for fashion and elegance. We look at portraits of French kings and think, so regal, but the more accurate reaction is, so itchy. The wig trend didn't start as a style statement. It started as a cover-up. Louis XIV began losing his hair young, likely tied to health issues, and the lovely medicine of the era. And the court turned wigs into a status uniform. Natural hair also attracted lice, so shaving your head and putting on a wig was basically pest control with better branding. And that famous white powder? It helped mask the smell of animal fats used for styling and the general funk underneath. High-class luxury was basically a designer hat sitting on top of a hygiene problem. 8. High heels were exclusively designed to make women look elegant and feminine. This is one of the funniest fashion ironies in history. High heels were originally invented for Persian male soldiers to keep their boots locked in stirrups while riding horses. They were the ultimate symbol of masculinity and military utility. Later, European aristocrats like King Louis XIV adopted them not to look pretty, but because he was short and insecure about his height. He wore red-soled heels to tower over his courtiers and look more intimidating. It was only much later that women adopted the style to emulate men, and men eventually stopped wearing them to avoid looking irrational. So, if you think heels are girly, you're actually looking at the preferred combat footwear of the Persian cavalry. 9. Ancient Roman elites built vomitoriums specifically to purge food so they could keep eating. This is one of the most enduring lies about the decadence of high society, likely because we love to hate the rich. You probably picture a marble room with buckets and feathers, but a vomitorium was actually just an architectural feature in a stadium. A wide corridor designed to let crowds spew out of the building rapidly. The word comes from vomir, meaning to discharge, but it referred to people exiting a theater, not lunch, exiting a stomach. While Roman emperors were certainly known for gluttony, they didn't have designated architectural wings dedicated to bulimia. If a Roman threw up at a feast, it was because they drank too much lead-sweetened wine, not because it was a scheduled part of the menu. It's a linguistic misunderstanding that turned a fire exit into a symbol of disgust. 10. Dom Perignon invented champagne and famously shouted, "Come quickly, I am tasting the stars." This quote appears on napkins and magnets everywhere, but it's a total marketing lie invented for an advertisement in the late 19th century. The real Dom Perignon was a monk who spent his entire life trying to stop the wine from bubbling. In his time, bubbles were considered a massive failure, a sign that the wine had spoiled and was re-fermenting in the bottle. He wasn't a visionary creating a luxury drink. He was a frustrated quality control manager trying to fix a manufacturing error. The elite only started calling it luxury later when they realized they could charge triple the price for what was essentially a bottling mistake. You aren't tasting the stars. You're tasting a monk's worst nightmare. 11. Having rotten black teeth was solely a sign of poverty and poor hygiene. In Elizabethan England, the script was completely flipped. Sugar was a brand new, astronomically expensive luxury import that only the super rich could afford. Queen Elizabeth I loved sweets so much that her teeth turned black from decay. Instead of being grossed out, the lower nobility saw this as the ultimate status symbol. If you had black teeth, it meant you were rich enough to destroy your mouth with sugar. It got so ridiculous that people with healthy white teeth would actually rub coal or soot on them to simulate rot, just to trick people into thinking they were wealthy enough to afford cavities. It was a fashion trend where people literally cosplayed as having dental disease to look cool. 12. The game of golf was named as an acronym for gentlemen only, ladies forbidden. This is one of those facts that grumpy uncles love to repeat at country clubs, but it is linguistically impossible. The word golf predates the modern use of acronyms by centuries. It actually comes from the Dutch word kolf, or kolve, meaning club. The acronym story was made up much later to justify keeping women off the course. Furthermore, the game wasn't started by elites in silk suits. It was likely started by bored Scottish shepherds hitting rocks with sticks into rabbit holes. It eventually became the sport of the rich because it requires massive amounts of expensive land and hours of free time. But its name has nothing to do with banning women. It's just a Dutch word for a stick. 13. The aristocracy possesses blue blood that makes them biologically distinct from commoners. Unless the royal family has been secretly crossbreeding with squids, their blood is as red as a communist flag. This elitist term comes from the Spanish phrase sangre azul, referring to the visible blue veins on the pale skin of the nobility. While the peasants were out in the fields getting tanned and leathery from actual work, the rich sat inside doing absolutely nothing, making their skin translucent enough to see the veins underneath. It wasn't a sign of genetic superiority. It was a symptom of extreme vitamin D deficiency and a sedentary lifestyle. Over time, they turned this sickly pallor into a status symbol to prove they didn't have to labor for a living. So, having blue blood is really just a fancy way of saying you need to go outside and touch some grass. 14. Living in a medieval castle was a fairy tale dream of luxury and comfort. Thanks to Disney, we imagine cozy fireplaces and tapestries, but the reality was more like living in a damp stone refrigerator that smelled like a sewer. Castles were built for war, not comfort. They had tiny windows, to shoot arrows, not to see the view, so it was pitch black inside. And the smell? There was no indoor plumbing, so people just did their business in a hole that dropped into the moat, the same moat that surrounded the house. The floors were often covered in rushes, straw, that weren't changed for years, collecting spit, beer, vomit, and dog urine. Basically, the King of England lived in conditions that would get a modern restaurant shut down by the health department in 5 minutes. 15. High society women in the Victorian era regularly fainted due to their impossibly tight corsets. The image of a delicate lady dramatically swooning into a gentleman's arms after cinching her waist to an 18-inch circumference is iconic, but largely exaggerated. While corsets certainly restricted movement and could be uncomfortable, most women did not lace them so tightly that they constantly passed out. The myth was perpetuated by moralists who criticized women's fashion as dangerous and frivolous, or by doctors who blamed every female ailment on their clothing rather than actual medical conditions. Fainting was often a social performance, a display of feminine delicacy or a subtle protest against social constraints rather than a direct consequence of a garment. It was less about the corset literally crushing their organs and more about the societal pressure crushing their spirits. 16. Medieval aristocrats used heavy spices on their food to mask the taste of rotting spoiled meat. You've probably heard this one in history class. The rich ate garbage covered in pepper to keep from vomiting. This is economic nonsense. In the Middle Ages, spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were astronomically expensive, sometimes costing more than gold. If you could afford to import saffron from the other side of the world, you could definitely afford to buy a fresh cow that hadn't been dead for 3 weeks. Using priceless spices to cover up the taste of bad meat would be like spraying a bottle of Chanel No. 5 on a dumpster fire. It's a waste of luxury on something worthless. The wealthy use spices to show off their insane budget, not to hide the fact that their chef was trying to poison them. 17. Using a fork is the oldest symbol of civilized, high-class dining. If you traveled back to a medieval royal banquet with a fork, you wouldn't be hailed as sophisticated. You'd be mocked as a sinner with artificial hands. For centuries, the church and the aristocracy actually banned forks, arguing that God gave humans fingers for a reason, and using a metal claw to eat was an insult to divine creation. When a Byzantine princess first brought a fork to Venice, the local elite were horrified by her excessive delicacy and arrogance. Real men, they argued, grabbed their roast with their bare hands. So, that utensil you use to feel polite was originally seen as a scandalous, demonic tool used only by people who were too stuck up to get their hands greasy like a normal person. 18. The perfectly manicured green lawn is a symbol of connecting with nature. We think of lawns as a standard home feature, but they originated as a massive, arrogant power move by French and English aristocrats. Historically, land was valuable only if it produced food. By planting acres of short grass that couldn't feed anyone, not even animals, the rich were shouting, "I am so wealthy I can afford to waste this entire field." It was a green desert, designed to prove they didn't need to grow potatoes to survive like the peasantry. Maintaining it required an army of servants cutting grass with scissors before lawnmowers existed. So, your dad's obsession with his grass isn't a love for nature. It's a subconscious attempt to mimic a 17th century French duke bragging about his unemployment. 19. Emperor Nero callously fiddled on a balcony while Rome burned to the ground. It's the perfect story to illustrate how much the elite hate the poor, but it is historically impossible. For starters, the violin wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. If Nero played anything, it would have been a lyre. But he wasn't even in the city when the fire started. He was 30 miles away at his villa in Antium. When he heard the news, he actually rushed back to Rome and opened his palace gardens to shelter the homeless victims. The rumor was likely started by his political enemies who wanted to paint him as a monster. So, he wasn't playing music, he was running a disaster relief center. The only thing getting burned that day was his reputation by fake news. 20. Opulent debutante balls are elegant, innocent rites of passage where young women are introduced to society. Forget the fairy tale image of young ladies gracefully waltzing into adulthood. These extravagant events were, and often still are, essentially high-stakes marriage markets disguised as parties. Historically, the entire purpose was for wealthy families to showcase their eligible daughters to equally wealthy bachelors, ensuring the continuation of pure bloodlines and the consolidation of fortunes. It wasn't about finding love, it was about arranged economic mergers in ball gowns. While modern debutante balls might pretend to celebrate achievements, the underlying message often remains. Here are our carefully curated assets, ready for acquisition. It's less a coming-of-age story and more a glorified trade show for the elite. 21. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was a poverty-stricken genius who died starving and unappreciated. We love the tortured artist trope, but Mozart wasn't poor because society failed him. He was broke because he spent money like a maniac. In his prime, he was earning the modern equivalent of $150,000 a year, a massive fortune for a musician. The problem was that he lived in luxury apartments, bought expensive clothes, and had a gambling habit that would make a Las Vegas whale blush. As for the pauper's grave, that's a translation error. He was buried in a common grave, which just meant a standard citizen's grave, not a ditch for the homeless. He didn't die of poverty, he died of bad budgeting and a high society lifestyle. 22. Calling the sport soccer is a vulgar American habit that annoys sophisticated British fans. If you say soccer in London today, you'll get sneered at for being uncultured. But the joke is on them. British aristocrats invented the word. In the 1800s, upper-class students at Oxford shortened association football to a soccer, and then just soccer to distinguish it from rugby. It was trendy university slang for the wealthy elite. It wasn't until the sport became popular with the working class, who called it football, that the upper crust stopped using soccer just to distance themselves from the poor. So when Americans use the word, they aren't destroying the language. They are actually using the original posh terminology that the British abandoned just to be snobs. 23. High society crusaders locked their wives in iron chastity belts to prevent cheating while they were at war. This is one of the most famous kinks in history, painting a picture of knights protecting their property with metal underwear. The truth is, these devices would have caused fatal sepsis or tetanus within days of wearing them. Can you imagine the hygiene of wearing a rusty metal diaper for 3 years? Most ancient chastity belts in museums are actually fakes made in the 18th and 19th centuries as jokes or bizarre curiosities for perverts. The idea that a woman could be locked up like a bicycle for years is a myth invented by later generations who were obsessed with the dark barbarism of the Middle Ages. If a knight came home after a crusade, he didn't need a key. He just needed to hope his wife hadn't changed the locks on the castle. 24. High tea is the sophisticated upper-class meal with tiny sandwiches and scones. If you invite a British aristocrat to high tea, they will look at you confused because you just invited them to a working-class dinner of beans and meat. Americans constantly mix this up. The fancy tea with the little cakes is called afternoon tea or low tea because it was eaten on low armchairs. High tea was called that because it was eaten at a high dining table by hungry factory workers and miners when they got home at 6 p.m. It was a heavy meal for sweating laborers, not a snack for ladies in gloves. Using the term high tea to sound fancy is the linguistic equivalent of wearing a tuxedo to a fast food drive-thru. You think you look posh, but you just have the wrong location. 25. The pure white marble statues of antiquity represent the clean, understated taste of the ancient elite. Walk into any museum or government building, and you see rows of bleached white stone, symbolizing logic and order. But the ancients would have thought this looked unfinished and cheap. In reality, Greek and Roman statues were originally painted in bright, gaudy psychedelic colors: neon blues, garish reds, and gold leaf. They looked less like fine art and more like plastic action figures or a carnival ride. The paint simply wore off over thousands of years. When Renaissance artists dug them up, they assumed the white was intentional and copied it. Our entire concept of classical elegance is based on the fact that paint peels off when you leave it in the dirt for 2 millennia. 26. George Washington, the elite founding father, wore a set of wooden teeth. Cute myth. Completely wrong. Wood would have turned to mush instantly because mouths aren't lumber yards. His dentures were a bizarre Frankenstein mix of metals and ivory. And yes, real human teeth entered the picture through an ugly system early America loved to pretend was normal. The wooden teeth story survived because it's safer for textbooks than the truth. So when Washington smiled, it wasn't charming folklore. It was 18th century dentistry doing its absolute worst, with the bill paid in status and cruelty. 27. Professional wine tasting is a highly refined science, restricted to the superior elite palate. We are told that a true connoisseur can detect hints of roasted saddle leather and morning dew in a glass of Merlot. However, scientific studies have repeatedly humiliated these so-called experts. In one famous experiment, top sommeliers were given white wine dyed with red food coloring, and they confidently described it using red wine adjectives like jammy and spiced. They were tasting the color, not the liquid. Another test showed that judges couldn't distinguish a $100 bottle from a cheap supermarket brand when the labels were hidden. Much of the high-end wine industry is just the placebo effect in a fancy bottle. You aren't paying for the taste, you're paying for the privilege of feeling superior to people who drink beer. 28. The monocle was an essential medical tool for the refined gentleman with poor eyesight. The caricature of the rich banker popping his monocle in surprise is legendary, but as an actual vision aid, it was a disaster. Optically, they were barely useful, and physically, they were a nightmare. You had to constantly scrunch your facial muscles just to keep the glass from falling into your soup, which is why monocle wearers always looked like they were smelling something bad. It was less about seeing clearly and more about accessorizing your face to look intimidating and wealthy. In the late 19th century, it became a fad specifically to look bored and skeptical of everything. Wearing a monocle wasn't about fixing a disability. It was about fashion signaling that you were too rich to be bothered with using 2 eyes. 29. Ancient Egyptian pharaohs were buried with their vast treasures to take with them into the afterlife. While it's true they were interred with incredible riches, the idea that they were just packing a cosmic carry-on for the next dimension misses a crucial and much more cynical point. Much of that treasure was actually an elaborate display of power and a form of economic control designed to maintain the pharaoh's influence even after death. The sheer spectacle of wealth served to legitimize the new pharaoh and reinforce the divinity of the ruling class to the terrified populace. It wasn't just about preparing for the afterlife. It was about ensuring the earthly power structure remained firmly in place. They weren't just taking their gold with them. They were using it to send a very expensive, very intimidating message to anyone who might question the new boss. 30. The phrase, "pulling yourself up by your bootstraps," comes from humble beginnings, symbolizing hard work and self-reliance. This cliché is thrown around by the elite to preach about individual responsibility. But it's actually an ironic idiom meant to describe an impossible task. You literally cannot lift yourself off the ground by pulling on your own boots. The original phrase mocked the idea of doing something absurd and logically impossible. It was never a sincere piece of advice for the poor. It was a sarcastic jab at the delusional idea that anyone can achieve anything if they just try hard enough, regardless of their circumstances. The wealthy hijacked a joke to justify their own inherited privilege, pretending that their success was purely self-made rather than funded by Daddy's trust fund. 31. The Palace of Versailles was the sweet-smelling pinnacle of hygiene and perfume. Movies show us a world of rose petals and scented powders, but in reality, the home of the French king smelled like a music festival porta-potty that hadn't been cleaned in a month. The palace was built without a functional sewage system for thousands of residents. The heavy use of perfume wasn't an artistic choice. It was a desperate, industrial-strength attempt to mask the stench of unwashed bodies and the fact that guests frequently relieved themselves in the hallways behind heavy curtains. Being a courtier wasn't glamorous. It was an endurance test for your nose. The scent of royalty was actually 5% lavender and 95% raw sewage and regret. 32. The buttons on the cuffs of a tailored suit jacket are a mark of high fashion and functional design. You've definitely seen them. That row of 3 or 4 buttons on the wrist that usually don't even open. They seem elegant, but their origin is disgusting. The most popular historical theory is that Napoleon Bonaparte ordered them to be sewn onto the sleeves of his soldiers' uniforms for one specific reason: to stop them from wiping their runny noses on their expensive jackets. It was essentially a snot blocker. Over time, this military hygiene hack migrated to civilian fashion, and now you pay extra for it. So, that sleek Italian suit doesn't represent sartorial excellence. It represents a historic attempt to force grown men to use a handkerchief instead of their sleeve. 33. The proverb, "blood is thicker than water," is treated like the official slogan of rich families everywhere. Protect the clan, defend the inheritance, never question grandpa's trust fund. But here's the twist. The version most people quote is the short, convenient one. There's a popular longer form people repeat. The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb, meaning the bonds you choose can matter more than the family you were born into. Whether or not that longer line is the true original, the point stands. Dynasties love the short version because it's perfect for guilt-tripping you into loyalty, especially when there's money involved. 34. The extravagant Faberge eggs were simply beautiful, jeweled gifts exchanged by Russian czars and their wives as tokens of love. While undeniably stunning, these aren't just fancy Easter eggs. They were often desperate attempts to patch up a crumbling marriage and a declining empire. The tradition started as a surprise gift from Emperor Alexander III to Empress Maria Feodorovna, meant to delight her during a difficult time. But as the Romanov dynasty faced increasing political unrest and personal marital strife, the eggs became more frequent, more elaborate, and more symbolic of a family trying to maintain appearances. They were a ridiculously expensive distraction, a glittering denial of the revolution brewing outside the palace walls. It's the ultimate example of buying your way out of marital problems, just with more diamonds and less therapy. 35. The ancient Romans lounged around in togas every day as the ultimate symbol of relaxed luxury. Thanks to Hollywood, we imagine the toga as a comfortable bedsheet, perfect for eating grapes. But in reality, it was a heavy, miserable torture device. A proper toga was a massive semicircle of wool, about 18 feet long, that was so complicated to fold that you couldn't put it on yourself. You needed a servant to wrap you up like a human burrito. It was incredibly hot, itchy, and restricted the use of your left arm completely. The toga wasn't casual wear. It was the Roman equivalent of a tuxedo that weighed 20 pounds. Romans hated wearing them so much that emperors had to issue decrees forcing people to put them on for official business. Seeing a Roman in a toga at home would be like seeing a modern guy watching Netflix in a three-piece suit. 36. Christopher Columbus had to fight the ignorant royal court who believed the earth was flat. This is the smart hero narrative we teach children, but it's a complete lie. Every educated aristocrat in Europe already knew the earth was round. The ancient Greeks had proved it nearly 2,000 years earlier. The Spanish monarchs didn't reject Columbus because they thought he'd fall off the edge. They rejected him because his math was garbage. He calculated the globe was much smaller than it actually is. The elites were right to mock him. He was embarking on a suicide mission. If the Americas hadn't accidentally been in the way, he and his crew would have starved to death in the open ocean. He wasn't a visionary fighting flat earthers. He was just a confident idiot who refused to listen to experts. 37. The tulip mania of the 17th century saw the Dutch elite trading entire mansions for a single flower bulb. We use this story to mock the stupidity of the rich, but historians have found that the crash was vastly exaggerated. While prices for rare bulbs did spike in a niche market of wealthy gamblers, there is almost no record of people actually bankrupting themselves or trading their family homes for a plant. The story was blown out of proportion by moralizing religious pamphlets of the time, which wanted to preach against the sins of greed and consumerism. It was essentially 17th century fake news designed to shame the wealthy. They liked flowers, sure, and they wasted money, but they weren't homeless because of a petal. It's a parable, not an economic reality. 38. When the first top hat was worn in London, it was such a shocking fashion statement that it caused a riot. The legend says that in 1797, John Hetherington walked down the street wearing a silk hat, causing women to faint, children to scream, and him to be arrested for disturbing the public peace. It's a fantastic story that paints high fashion as edgy and dangerous, but it's a total marketing fabrication. There is no police record of the arrest, and the story only appeared in a newspaper decades later, likely planted by hatters to generate buzz. It was the 18th century equivalent of a viral stunt. The hat was just a hat. The only thing it disturbed was the skyline, but the upper class loves a fake origin story to make their silly accessories seem revolutionary. 39. During the 1929 stock market crash, ruined bankers threw themselves out of skyscraper windows in droves. It's the ultimate movie image, rich guys raining down like karma with a necktie. But the mass jump story is wildly exaggerated. A few dramatic cases got blasted across tabloids, and the legend took off because people wanted it to be true. Most of the elite didn't leap off buildings. They tightened belts, fired staff, and waited for the next lifeline. When the super rich lose money, they don't usually jump from windows. They jump straight into a meeting to ask who's covering the losses. 40. The Dark Ages were a time of misery and stupidity where high culture vanished until the Renaissance saved us. This term is the biggest marketing scam in history, invented by Renaissance elitists like Petrarch. They wanted to make their own era look cooler and more enlightened, so they labeled the previous centuries as dark and barbaric to create a contrast. In reality, the so-called Dark Ages saw the invention of universities, massive architectural advancements, and significant scientific progress. It wasn't a black hole of intelligence. It was just a period that didn't obsess over Roman statues. Calling it the Dark Ages is just the historical version of a hipster trashing everything that was popular before they arrived. The only thing dark about it was the lighting, and that's only because the light bulb hadn't been invented yet. So now you've seen it, class wasn't cleaner, smarter, or more refined. It was louder, smellier, and way more insecure than anyone admits. Here's the real test. Which of these lies do you still see people defending today like it's sacred truth? Drop the one that made you irrationally angry in the comments. Not the fun one, the one you hate admitting you believed. And if you like watching fake prestige get dragged by facts, hit like, subscribe, and stay close. The elite hate curiosity more than poverty.